Welcome back to the channel. My name is Chris and I work behind the scenes here in our museum's costume shop. The tailors and seamstresses who work in our costume shop are responsible for researching, reproducing, and maintaining the historical clothing worn by our staff in the outdoor areas. Over the decades, we've sewn together thousands of authentic reproduction garments for our museums. All of the clothing tells a story, and some of those stories are about Virginia Indians, English mariners, musketeers, the first women at Jamestown, enslaved peoples brought here against their will, and those fighting for equality. Someone recently asked me what my favorite garment was and what story that garment told. That was an easy question to answer. Of all the fancy and beautiful garments I've personally sewn together over the years here at the museum, the garment that tells my favorite story comes from this very simple, undyed, plain, common jacket worn by runaway enslaved peoples. Just a quick programming note before we get started. I'm going to be replacing some of the words used in the original primary sources from 1781. So the words enslaved peoples were not an actual term used back then, but I'm going to be using that today in today's video. Thanks. When Lieutenant General Cornwallis invaded Virginia in the spring of 1781, thousands of enslaved peoples fled their masters and sought refuge within the British Army. Estimates vary widely, but anywhere from 12,000 to 30,000 enslaved peoples began to follow Cornwallis's army, along with anything they could steal from their former owners, like fine horses, clothing, food, and livestock. Cornwallis knew this was a huge setback for the American economy in the South. The more enslaved people he could convince to leave their plantations, the better chances he had of crippling the American war effort. While Cornwallis was initially thrilled by this concept, several problems arose very quickly. The first of which is that Cornwallis is now responsible for feeding, clothing, housing, and the care of the runaway enslaved peoples. The logistics of taking on tens of thousands of refugees now became an economic strain on the British war effort. Just moving the army from town to town was an impossible effort, with thousands of extra bodies and horses on the roads slowing down the British column of troops. The second problem was that order and discipline in the British ranks and camps began to break down very quickly. You see, according to British military law, officers were permitted to have a limited number of servants employed in the camp to help them with duties such as grooming horses, mending clothing, and cooking, that sort of thing. Colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, the upper end of the British Army, for example, were permitted to have 2 servants employed to aid them. Captains and lieutenants, a little bit below them, were permitted to have 1 servant. Enlisted personnel weren't permitted to have any servants. But officers and enlisted men were quickly taking advantage of the high volume of refugees appearing in their camps daily. In June 1781, Captain Johann Ewald, who commanded some of the German troops in Virginia, described the chaos in the British ranks. Every officer had 4 to 6 horses and 3 to 4 runaway enslaved peoples, as well as 1 or 2 runaway enslaved peoples for a cook and maid. Every soldier's woman was mounted on a horse and also had a runaway enslaved person on horseback for her personal servant. Each squad had 1 or 2 horses and several runaway enslaved peoples. Every non-commissioned officer had 2 horses and 1 runaway enslaved person. It was clear that this sudden influx of refugees into the British military system was hampering Cornwallis's efforts to wage a successful campaign, and he needed a quick solution to restore order and discipline in the British ranks. First thing Cornwallis did was remind the officers and men about the regulations, how many servants each person was allowed to have based on their rank, and how many horses they were allowed to have based on their rank. Then, on May 21st, 1781, Cornwallis decreed the number or names of the corps to be marked in a conspicuous manner on the jacket of each runaway enslaved person. He went on to say that all enslaved persons who are not marked according to the orders will be sent away from the army. So in the reproduction coat our museum made, we marked this coat exactly how Cornwallis instructed, with the name of the regiment marked conspicuously on the front of the coat. We chose the 33rd Regiment of Foot since that was Cornwallis's own regiment from earlier in his military career. So, in theory, this system of identification should have solved the problem by limiting the number of refugees who became dependent on the army. Problem solved, right? Well, not exactly. You see, the problem still persisted for a few reasons. The first of which is that it is really easy to counterfeit this mark. Even if you couldn't read or write, you could still make out these shapes and copy them very quickly. This meant that everyone, enslaved person or soldier, could now recreate their very own fake ID of sorts to get past the military guards and get into camp. The other problem is that Cornwallis still had an unrealistic number of non-military dependents following the army around. As 1781 wore on and the siege of Yorktown started, supplies ran low, and Cornwallis was deeply concerned for the well-being and safety of the runaway enslaved people in his care, especially after he ran out of smallpox vaccinations. Cornwallis wrote to General Charles O'Hara from Yorktown saying, "The sick runaway enslaved persons are about 1,000 in number. They would inevitably perish if our support was withdrawn from them. The people of this country are more inclined to fire upon than receive and protect a runaway enslaved person whose complaint is the smallpox." Because of the lack of medicine and supplies, Cornwallis did eventually abandon the enslaved peoples during the siege of Yorktown. He sent them into no man's land, which was between the British and the American lines. After the British surrender at Yorktown, the enslaved people were sent back to their former masters, and it would take several more generations and a civil war to finally set them free. In the end, there is no happy ending for the runaway enslaved people who fled their masters seeking shelter within the British ranks. At our museum, we use this jacket as a storytelling device each day to tell visitors about the role of the free blacks and enslaved peoples during the American Revolution. Thanks for letting me share this story with you. It's truly one of the most tragic and compelling stories that we tell at the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown, and that's why this coat is my favorite garment that we've reproduced here. Think about the clothing that you're wearing right now. What story does that clothing tell about you and your life?